Good day, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, distinguished speakers, colleagues, participants, and friends. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining this engaging and exciting panel on the UN Open-Ended Working Group's final report and the future of cyber governance. I'm Danielle Yao, lead the Cyber Law and Governance Program at the Center for International Law. And I'm particularly delighted, in particular today, to welcome this panel of experts, as well as colleagues and friends to this webinar session today. And also thanks to my colleague Sam White, who has kindly agreed to shoulder the moderator's role today. Now, having followed the journey and discussions in the OEWG, I have seen how challenging, but at the same time, how rewarding it can be to build consensus in such a complex and fast-changing field. The final report, while not perfect, reflects the outcome of a lengthy and complex process with some notable deliverables such as the point of contact registry, and also some disappointments over, for example, the seeming brevity of the portion of the final report documenting the discussions on international law. In this, I look forward to the panel's evaluation of the achievements of the OEWG. The work is just beginning and there remain challenges. And as we look forward to the formal adoption of the report and the establishment of the permanent mechanism, also known as the global mechanism, I also look forward to hearing the experts their reflections on the aspirations and the future discussions on cyber governance in this new construct. So once again, I'm delighted to welcome our experts, Hugh, Kubo, Michael, Alan, Pauline, and thank you very much for joining us today and agreeing to share your thoughts. And with that, let me turn this over to Sam to take this discussion forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. So today we have 5 presenters and everyone is going to talk for approximately 10 minutes. And then the idea is at the end, we'll collectively take questions that all the different panelists can address. First off, we have Dr. Hugh Llewellyn. He's a Senior Global Fellow and Distinguished Visiting Scholar at CIL. Amongst many other hats that he has worn include former Director, Codification Division at UN Office of Legal Affairs, as well as the former Secretary of the International Law Commission. So he's going to start us off with a brief overview of where we've been up to in the process and give us his thoughts as well on sort of the consequences of the documents. Hugh, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you, Danielle, and to the whole of the Centre for International Law team who've put today's panel together. Thank you very much. As Sam just said, they've asked me to begin with a brief outline of the key points in the working group's final report from July this year, which I'll do. But let me begin with a tribute to Ambassador Burhan Ghafoor of Singapore, who did such an excellent job of chairing a difficult working group. Also to my former colleagues in the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, who did an equally excellent job of supporting the working group throughout. So the final report from July, much of its content does not move substantive issues forward from the previous annual progress reports to 2024 in particular, because it's concerned primarily with recommending what should continue to be discussed in the global mechanism. I'll come to the mechanism in a few moments. So the report recommends the continued discussion of the 5 pillars of work which were central to the working group's work over the last 5 years: existing and potential threats to security in the use of ICTs, rules, norms, and principles of responsible state behavior, how international law applies in the use of ICTs, the development and implementation of confidence-building measures, and capacity-building efforts. Importantly, states are encouraged to continue to share their national positions and state practice on how international law applies in cyberspace. The UN Secretariat is requested to make these views available on the website, so this will be a good supplement to the excellent cyber law toolkit, which Kubo leads on. And states are encouraged to continue to support capacity building in the area of international law so that all states are able to contribute to this discussions going forwards in the global mechanism. So turning to the mechanism itself, its establishment in principle and the basics of its functioning had already been agreed in July 2024 in the third annual progress report of the working group and endorsed in December 24 by the General Assembly in a resolution. The final report now adds additional elements to what was previously agreed. So I'll just run through the basics. It will be a permanent standing body rather than ad hoc. Its parent body will be the first committee of the General Assembly. This is the Disarmament and International Security Committee of the General Assembly. It will take decisions by consensus, as the working group did. It will again be open to participation by all states, but also stakeholders, including businesses, non-governmental organizations, and academia. There will be a first organizational meeting no later than March 26, and the first substantive meeting by June 26. Its meetings will be structured in 5-year cycles, 2 substantive biennial cycles, followed by a 1-year review cycle in the 5th year. It will meet twice per year in New York, 2 weeks each time, so 1 week of plenary and 1 week of dedicated thematic groups, which again I'll come on to in a moment. There may be intersessional meetings. This depends on consultations by the chair with states. And as I just mentioned, there will be a review conference in every 5th year. This is to provide strategic direction and guidance for the following 4 years, and also to make any adjustments to the functioning of the mechanism which might be agreed by states. So the dedicated thematic groups, which are an important component of the mechanism, these have already been determined as Group 1, looking at specific challenges in the sphere of ICT security in the context of international security, and Group 2, looking at accelerating ICT security capacity building. So what we can take from that, I think, is that neither of the dedicated thematic groups seem to be considering the normative, the regulatory elements of the working group's prior work, the application of international law in cyberspace, and the 11 voluntary non-binding norms of responsible state behavior. So moving on now to my own views, I have 4 main points. The first is that although it's important that states in the working group have agreed to perpetuate these discussions through the global mechanism, we should also recognize that the key normative aspect of its work on the application of international law is essentially where it was in 2015. Not very much has changed since then. If neither of the dedicated thematic groups will be looking at the application of international law or the 11 non-binding norms, and if this situation is locked in for 5 years until the review conference in 2030, the prospects do not seem good. It does not seem conducive to making further significant progress on the normative elements of the work. My second point is that not only are the rules and principles of international law that have been agreed in the working group as applicable in cyberspace largely unchanged over a rather lengthy period, they also remain incomplete and at a level of generality that tells us little or nothing about how they apply in cyberspace. I won't expand on this point because I'm sure that other speakers are going to do so. My third point is that although geopolitical tensions and consensus decision-making in the working group explain quite a lot of the lack of progress on the normative issues, there's also a broader question about the extent to which cyber-capable states, in fact, want legally binding rules regulating cyber operations, or prefer to maintain a margin for clandestine operational maneuver. Despite the high and increasing number of national position statements that have been issued, these are not always matched by the actions of states in reality, nor is it common at all for states to invoke international law when faced with cyber operations. So research suggests that more than 1,000 cyber operations of various types have been carried out over the last 20 years or so by around 30 states from all regions, with about 130 states being the targets of these cyber operations. So the same research also suggests that a large number of these operations have been against critical national infrastructure, and hardly any of them involve physical destructive force. So in a nutshell, what this suggests is that the so-called gray zone of hybrid conflict is a critical area for regulation, but it also raises a question about whether cyber-capable states in fact want such regulation or prefer to rely on their own cyber capabilities to pursue and protect their national interests. I would also note that it is the 11 voluntary non-binding norms that actually address these questions head-on in concrete terms, the protection of critical national infrastructure in particular. My fourth point is about artificial intelligence. AI is not sufficiently, in my view, dealt with in the final report or indeed in the predecessor annual progress reports. It has appeared in the last few such reports as a potential threat and is not dealt with expressly in the substantive sections of the report or in any of the recommendations. The reality is that the great majority of cyber operations are now AI-enabled or AI-powered. I have seen a figure recently suggesting that around 80% of such cyber operations may now be AI-enabled. The ever-increasing ability of AI-powered cyber operations to intrude and do damage should be taken on board, in my view, in the global mechanism and made a much more significant part of its discussions. So moving briefly on to the final point, which is the prospects and challenges for making progress in the mechanism. I'm afraid that we need to be realistic rather than optimistic, in my view. Geopolitical tensions will carry over from the working group, and the consensus rule continues. The fact that international law and the 11 voluntary non-binding norms do not feature in either of the dedicated thematic groups reduces the opportunities for in-depth discussion and for significant progress, I would suggest. My very final thought then is that despite what I've just said, there are an overwhelming majority of states who do want to make progress on these normative questions. This is apparent from the adoption of the General Assembly resolution in 2023, entitled the Programme of Action. I won't go into any more depth on that, but this was adopted by, I think, 161 positive votes of states. This gives you an idea of the extent of the majority in favor of making progress on normative issues. So these states have the numbers and the voting power to force progress. And by that, I mean that although the consensus rule continues to apply in the global mechanism, it does not do so in the General Assembly, the parent body, where majority voting is the UN rule of procedure. So if frustrations grow over time, particularly if no progress is achieved on the normative aspects of regulating cyber operations during the mechanism's first 5-year cycle, these states could, if they wish, initiate or use the threat of initiating draft General Assembly resolutions and voting them through to force progress. Now, obviously doing this would need to be very carefully considered and the advantages and disadvantages weighed by states at the time. But I wanted to mention it as part of the dynamic. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that consensus is not the rule throughout everything that's relevant for the global mechanism going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. I think particularly there, one thing that always comes up is this idea of how states are either pausing or trying to push forward the legal frameworks in order for their strategic ambiguity. And I'd like to come back to that later, but moving away from states and into the other key player in this area is Michael, who we're talking. He's a director at Microsoft's digital diplomacy team within the customer security and trust section. He partners with governments, international organizations, civil society, and industry to advance responsible behavior. I'm very keen to hear from Michael in terms of how you go about doing that practically and what your thoughts are on the latest development.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for the opportunity to share an industry perspective on where global cyber governance stands today and how we can make the next cycle count. I'll try to cover 4 areas. So first, what worked and what did not in the OEWG from an industry perspective. Second, what I would say meaningful stakeholder engagement could or should actually mean in practice. Third, a short list of emerging issues that need deeper state industry dialogue. And fourth, the pragmatic path for global cyber governance going forward. So firstly, the OEWG, what worked, what did not, and why it matters. Starting on positive, what worked. We now have a single agreement on a single track global mechanism. That's one forum, not many competing forums. I think that matters because, of course, coherence is better than fragmentation, and it gives states, regional organizations, and industry one place to bring lessons and to request capacity building and also to measure progress, which is very important. Second, confidence building measures have in part moved from paper to practice. The point of contact directory is real, and we've seen the first simulations of it. That does help turn norms into muscle memory, essentially who calls whom and with what information and how quickly. The practical benefit of this in the long run, of course, is to be determined. Conscious that the ASEAN Regional Forum has had a point of contact directory for a long time now, I would defer to other participants here or perhaps individuals in the audience as to whether or not that has delivered value. If it has, hopefully that's something we will see replicated in the POC directory going forward. But thirdly, on a positive with the OEWG, the threat picture is now more practical. In the final report and across a number of the APRs, the annual progress reports, saw recognition of ransomware, critical infrastructure, supply chain compromises. This most recent cycle explicitly brought AI, quantum, and foreign influence operations into scope, just as Hugh was outlining. I think that makes it easier to align policy to the actual risks that we face, actually that we all face. Fourth, there is now more room for regional work to plug into UN outputs. I think that really helps with implementation because regions can often move faster and can tailor their approaches to local realities. But there are some gaps. As Hugh was just outlining, as I'm sure as other colleagues in this call will focus on further, the international law section is quite thin and it's cautious. A number of key questions have really been just kicked down the road. And again, as Hugh outlined, maybe that's just a reflection of the point in time that we're at. But more needs to be done here. Equally, stakeholder modalities still allow for single state veto, and so access remains uncertain. Equally, preposition in language was dropped, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. And there was little traction on mercenary, sub-mercenary, and spyware governance. Again, I'll speak more about that later. So what does this all mean for things at the moment? There is a kind of a center of gravity. I think this previous phase was really about implementation, not drafting new norms. And I understand the arguments on both sides, and I won't relitigate them here. But we have seen some progress where success is now measurable by use, drills, templates, capacity programs, and resourcing. And what we need to now see going forward are essentially fewer paragraphs and more practice. And let's spend a moment thinking about stakeholder engagement and what meaningful engagement should mean. If we agree that implementation and/or implementation and norms is the goal, then meaningful stakeholder engagement really can't be a slogan on its own. It needs to be a minimum viable level of participation that is predictable and also useful for states. And I think a couple elements will help. Firstly, stand-in accreditation for the full 5-year cycle, not relitigated access at the beginning of every single session. Additionally, hybrid access to the work streams so stakeholders can join the dedicated thematic groups in real time and not only on essentially set piece plenaries with varying levels of participation from states. I think as well parity for written inputs, but also coordination for inputs from stakeholders. How do stakeholders identify strength in numbers and not just speak in a singular voice? So more coalitions and engage in between sessions when member states are essentially drafting and coming up with their positions and not just during the actual sessions themselves. So whilst modalities do remain uncertain or weak at best, stakeholders can still add value. Again, coalitions to submit joint technical briefs. This could be tied to specific agenda items and offering concise statements which are linked together. If there is a modality where stakeholders are only entitled to 1 3-minute intervention, if stakeholders coordinate their interventions, then perhaps over the course of 10 different interventions, you have a joint 30-minute statement provided together to the floor. I think as well, publishing case studies and linking real incidents to the UN framework on norms is invaluable too. And capacity building consortia. So states, regional organizations, and capacity building vendors working together to deliver more tangible outputs. So playbooks, tabletop exercises, and after action reports, and ideally in a much more coordinated way than we have seen happen so far. I think there are a number of concrete asks which we can have for governments and future chairs of the global mechanism. So for example, for each DTG, one idea would be to reserve agenda-linked technical briefings, ideally nominated by rotating regional groups, with one briefer having a seat dedicated to coming from the global majority at every single meeting. I think mandating parity for written inputs, so ensuring the secretariat posts stakeholder papers on a side-by-side basis with state papers on the same webpage with the same deadlines and similar formats. And also, everything I say here does quite importantly keep the process state-led. That's an important thing to recognize. But what matters is making stakeholder contributions more predictable, more transparent, and more useful, far better than the stakeholder modalities that we had in the OEWG to date. There are a number of issues which really need deeper state-industry dialogue. And so let me just highlight a couple. Each of these, I think, are quite suited to the global mechanism, but are also workable in parallel tracks where needed. So firstly, a quite crucial one would be cloud as critical infrastructure. We've moved from recognition to obligation, but actually there are unanswered questions as to what does that mean in practice. So for example, crisis playbooks. We need something along the lines of standard UN-aligned templates for incident classification with minimum data needed from providers and clear understanding of who calls who between national points of contact and cloud security operation centers. I think as well assurance baselines, so committing all providers to security logs by default, as well as tamper-proof admin logs, independent audits and post-incident lessons learned reports, again mapped to UN norms, and actually just strong baseline segmentation of data for better protection of data held in the cloud as well. Second, on the topic of prepositioning versus espionage, whether we like it or not, states tolerate espionage, full stop, that's just a fact. They do not tolerate, some do not tolerate, prepositioning to the same level, but we need to be better at differentiating between the two. So practical indicators and policy triggers so that we can better understand what might constitute prepositioning versus espionage. So indicators of prepositioning might include long-lived persistence in systems, access to backups, staging, wiper or ransomware tooling, near critical infrastructure, and also synchronized footholds across multiple operators, either in one sector or across a region. If those indicators are observed, there are unknown answers to what are then the policy triggers. When do we notify the point of contact network? When do we elevate to the diplomatic track or signal that norms are at risk of being breached? And again, what is the process? Is it a sort of 24 to 72-hour fact-finding involving the target, the provider, and relevant certs, followed by any sharing through the POC directory? What about coordinated public communication that names the implicated norms, even if formal attribution is still pending? Turning thirdly to cyber mercenaries and the commercial spyware market, the goal should be to reduce demand and mobility. So how do we do that? Well, due diligence for buyers is one measure, so human rights risk screening before purchasing, as well as a public buyer policy, essentially involving no procurement if vendors fail basic controls. And also export and brokerage guardrails, so align into something similar to the Wassenaar Agreement, so controls with end-use attestations and clear breach of terms consequences. You very well outlined the growing risk of AI-enabled operations, and there is more to be unpacked in the global mechanism and beyond as to what secure by design should look like and what is the role of diplomatic processes in that. So how do we establish norms? How do we establish even understanding, basic understanding among member states? There are some model security basics, which I think many member states don't yet have a concrete enough understanding of. So can we make red teaming mandatory? What does an evaluation for a jailbreak and data exfiltration look like? How do we have rate limits and abuse monitoring on high-risk tools? So what are the operational controls? What do audit logs for model use look like? Are guardrails that block exploit generation at scale? And also, how do we understand what are the critical use cases and risks? So for example, deepfake-driven influence operations that target elections or crises. And what about model-assisted reconnaissance and exploitation? Large language model-assisted phishing, privilege exploitation, lateral movement. These topics all require joint analysis, not just sort of parallel monologues. And across all the 4 themes which I've outlined, I think there's a common connection for them all. And that is that states, industry, civil society, they need to better understand and address these problems together. That includes through the global mechanism where possible, but also through complementary processes where perhaps speed and specialization is needed. So with that, we can turn finally to the future of global cyber governance and trying to find a pragmatic path. I'll try to keep things simple. Firstly, keep international law moving, even without sufficient attention in the upcoming global mechanism. So encourage more national positions, just as Thailand successfully launched recently in July, more regional statements as well. I also think more statements or initial statements from industry, including from Microsoft, as well as scenario workshops with partners like Unidia and academia to help bring further clarity. I think as well, avoiding fragmentation by using regional organizations as implementation partners. So ASEAN, the AU, OAS, OSCE, Pacific Island Forum, and connect them to the UN mechanisms. And again, the connected tissue here can be organizations like Unidia and the Global Forum on cyber expertise. Third, and very, very importantly, is to clarify complementarity within the UN system. So in other words, what is the role of the General Assembly versus the UN Security Council? We've seen real progress in the Security Council's engagement on cyber and AI in recent years. High-level debates, RA formula meetings, sessions that have put cybersecurity implications for international peace and security on the table. Yet there is still some resistance, but also mixed messages about where these issues belong. There is a logical point here that really deserves clarity. If a state argues that cyber operations are matters of international peace and security serious enough to warrant legally binding regime and stricter sovereignty protections, then by default, the UN Security Council, which has a unique mandate of maintaining international peace and security, has a role to play when major incidents occur. It's not possible to frame cyberspace as a security domain when negotiating rules, but then declare it as a non-security matter when the UN Security Council considers a response. In the UN system, the General Assembly is essentially the engine room for cyber stability. It sets the long-term agenda, codifies shared expectations through norms and resolutions, and now via the global mechanism, it builds the practical machinery for implementation. The Security Council has a unique mandate under the Charter. It should, I think inevitably will, convene when major cyber incidents threaten international peace and security. In those moments, the Council can surface trusted technical facts, signal collective red lines, and where warranted, mobilize consequences through its established toolkit. So just to sum up, we have one forum that's good. We need to use it. We need to focus on implementation as well as norm development and measure, and not just more paragraphs. We need more stakeholder engagement because it has simply been insufficient so far. And that stakeholder engagement needs to be predictable and useful. Again, standard accreditation, hybrid access, parity with states. Again, that will help translate expertise into outcomes. If we do these things, hopefully the next time we will gather at the end of the global mechanism, we won't just be comparing whether or not the point of contact directory has been used or not, the number of countries that have adopted shared playbooks, but actually we will have seen real progress that protects citizens, companies, and governments as well. Thank you, Sam. Back to you.
Thank you. Something perhaps we can talk about later, but in the sense of corporations as gatekeepers of international law, and you're talking there about secure by design, and if they don't meet these requirements, we won't deal with them. But instantly that impacts 2, 3, 4 billion people in a way that perhaps lawyers could only ever dream of in legislation. So perhaps we can talk about how international law shapes what you think in terms of how you design policy. We'll jump from corporations back into the nitty-gritty of states with Alan, who is a legal advisor in the International Affairs Division of Attorney General's Chambers here in Singapore. His portfolio is quite wide, but it includes advising on a range of international law issues in cyberspace and digital technologies. Since 2019, he has been advising the Singaporean delegation to the OEWG and was involved in the preparation of Singapore's national position. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Samuel, and thank you very much to the Center for International Law for putting this session together. Very pleased to be here. I would say that overall, from our perspective, we were rather satisfied, and we thought that the final report of the OEWG represented a good outcome for the process. Given the current geopolitical climate, we saw the adoption of the final report by consensus as a remarkable achievement in itself. So overall, we would say that we were very happy with the final report, and we acknowledged that the final report could have gone into more depth, could have gone into more detail, especially on international law, and that is something that we certainly acknowledge. But we also understood the constraints and the challenges that were inherent throughout the course of the process. So these were these were things that we bore in mind. And given the process, given the inherent challenges, given the climate, we saw the final report as a positive and satisfactory outcome. So that's a very brief overview of our perspective on the final report. I'll now go into some specific areas as in the section on international law, which from a state's perspective, we were relatively happy with. Firstly, we were happy with the report's reaffirmation of international law, in particular, the UN Charter at paragraph 39, as being applicable and essential to the maintenance of peace, security, and stability, as well as promoting an open, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful ICT environment. This was an important statement and an important reaffirmation for us, because from our perspective, this was a key statement that underscored the applicability of international law, as well as the UN Charter to the ICT environment, which in itself is fundamental to us. From Singapore's perspective, application of international law to the UN Charter to the ICT environment is a fundamental tenet that should underpin discussions in this area. Secondly, we were also glad to see paragraph 41 of the report, where a number of important principles were underscored. The principles of state sovereignty and sovereign equality, the settlement of disputes by peaceful means under Article 2.4, under Article 2.3 of the UN Charter, the principle of non-intervention, as well as the prohibition against the use of force under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. From our perspective, these are fundamental principles to us as well, which certainly merit emphasis in the final report. And we were very happy that paragraph 41 of the report does that. And from our perspective, emphasizing and underscoring these principles in the final report cemented their place in the acquis, which represented a good outcome for us. We also saw paragraphs 43B and C of the report as a positive development. The publication and sharing of national or regional positions represent an important component in the progressive development of the acquis to us. And we were glad to see that this was strongly encouraged in the final report. For Singapore, we embarked on that journey to publish our national position sometime between 2019 to 2021, and we eventually managed to publish our national statement in 2021. And we were very heartened to see that since then, more states have come forward to publish their positions. And we were very heartened to see that since then, we have also seen a number of regional positions representing a number of states putting forth their positions and their views on how international law ought to apply to cyberspace as well. And this to us are all significant positive developments in developing the body of law the body of international law that would apply to cyberspace. And we were very heartened to see these developments since the publication of our own national statement. And so overall, I would say that the report could have covered more in terms of depth and detail. This is something that we acknowledge. For example, in the elaboration of the application of international humanitarian law, we thought that perhaps more elaboration could have been made in the report. As well as the various principles derived from the UN Charter, the prohibition against the use of force, principles of state sovereignty, sovereign equality, as well as the principle of non-intervention. We thought that there was certainly room for greater and further elaboration in the report when it comes to these principles as well. However, as I said earlier, we understand the constraints and the challenges inherent within the process. We also understand that there was a lot of challenge in terms of facilitating the process because of the current geopolitical climate. So these were all constraints and challenges that we had to take into account. And given the circumstances, we thought that it would be difficult. It might be difficult to expect the needle to move much further in the spirit of consensus. And so this was why, overall, I would say that from our perspective, we were happy with the report. We were happy with the outcome. And to reiterate, though there could have been more room to move the needle further, we thought that this report would set a good foundation, a good basis for the future mechanism to build upon, and for the body of international law that is applicable to cyberspace to be further developed in the years to come within the future mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. We'll move then to Kubo from an academic perspective. So Kubo Macek is a professor of international law at the University of Exeter. He's also general editor of the Cyber Law Toolkit that everyone has been referencing, and which I will give a unprompted round of applause for. He doesn't pay me any cash to say that. It is practical and it is useful. And he's also co-author on a handbook on developing a national position on international law and cyber activities. So Kubo is currently as an academic, but he also previously worked as a legal advisor for the ICRC in Geneva. And I think he'll give us a good balance of academic and practical.
Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you for your kind words, including about the toolkit. We are always happy to hear when people are using this resource. So thank you very much for that. In my time, I'm going to make 3 points, and my job is made easier because a number of colleagues before have already covered some of the points. So probably I will take less than 10 minutes, but I'll definitely not take more. So my 3 points will be first looking at the OEWG final report from an international law perspective. So perhaps offering some additional analysis to what we have already heard. Then secondly, I would like to talk a little bit about where we are right now on international law discussions. So what are the unresolved and maybe some emerging questions that we have identified in our research. And then finally, my third point will be what can we actually learn from all of this? What can we learn from the past regarding how progress can be made on questions of international law? So firstly, let's start with the report. So if I were to sum up my view from an academic perspective, I would say that the final report is definitely a diplomatic success, but it is something of a missed opportunity from the perspective of international law. Now, I want to take a step back and say that it's obvious to, I think, everyone on this call that the work over the past few years was really extensive. And some of the people on this call have contributed very directly to the work of the OEWG. And I would like to also say that a number of states have really genuinely tried to advance the group's mandate, which was in part to promote common understandings on how international law applies in the cyber context. And so, one clear highlight in that regard that came earlier this year was the cross-regional working paper on areas of convergence, which was supported by this cross-regional group of 21 states, including Thailand. We have Pawin on the panel who will speak just after me. So, from the perspective of multilateralism, I think I agree with what everyone so far has said. It's very impressive that consensus was reached. And I think that Ambassador Burhan Ghafoor from Singapore really deserves a lot of praise for this achievement, as does the UN's Office of Disarmament Affairs. And so also when we look beyond international law, some progress and some significant progress has been made in these other areas. Daniel has outlined some of it. And then I think we all agree that the establishment of the global mechanism itself is an achievement. But now when we zoom in on questions of international law, and I think that's also a theme that's coming across. People express it in different terms, but the progress has been quite limited. And I think, the words that I used in the EGIL talk post that I wrote just after coming back from New York in July was a missed opportunity. So maybe let me elaborate on that a little bit more. If you look at the international law section in the report, it contains about 8 numbered paragraphs. But really, the section that discusses what could be described as common understandings are found in paragraph 41 that Alan just before me mentioned. And I agree with him that these sub-paragraphs of paragraph 41 mention fundamental principles of international law. But from my perspective, what they do is they restate what has previously been agreed. So as was also said, they don't really move the needle. And the only paragraph or sub-paragraph that contains new language, which we didn't have in previous group of governmental experts or GGE reports or OEWG report from 2021, is sub-paragraph E, which says that basically that conduct in cyberspace that does not violate the prohibition on the use of force may, depending on circumstances, breach sovereignty or non-intervention. So I'm going to come back to these rules because I agree that they are fundamental and really important. But even though this new subparagraph is accurate, it doesn't actually add that much to our understanding, because it doesn't tell us anything more about when these principles would be violated or what such conduct might look like in practice. So it is, in my post, I described it as a truism. We can all agree with it, but it doesn't really advance the discussion much further. So in short, to summarize my first point, I would say the report is diplomatically really impressive, but there still remains a lot of work to do. Although maybe, as Alan has said, it would be, it wouldn't be right to expect much more in the current geopolitical climate. And on that, there are better experts than me. So moving to the second point, where are we on the contentious issues of international law, and what are some of the emerging questions of international law? So maybe, Sam, you kindly mentioned the new handbook on developing a national position on international law and cyber activities, which is this book. It has now been published and it's freely available. Daniel, who spoke at the opening of the panel, was one of our advisory board members, and thank you very much, Daniel, for all your contributions to the project. So in the context of that project, over the past year and a half, we met with 46 states to map how they think about the application of international law to cyber activities. And our main aim with the project was to synthesize best practices for developing a national position on these issues. So the bulk of the book is, like an IKEA flat pack furniture assembly set of instructions. If you're writing a national positions, here's what you want to do in a sequence of steps. But in order to discuss the process, we also had to map the substantive legal issues. And this is actually the biggest chapter in the handbook. It's chapter 4, which maps the main legal debates. There are 12 sections. I will not go into all of them in detail, but I would just, by way of kind of the headline topics, the big 3 that kept coming up from states in those closed door workshops and that are coming across, if you look at the 35 states that have published their national positions. So the big 3 topics are sovereignty, non-intervention, and the use of force, which are exactly those that are also mentioned in paragraph 41E of the OEWG report. So the real disagreement on all of those lies in the thresholds. So when exactly does cyber conduct cross the line to, for example, an unlawful intervention or to an unlawful use of force? And that's where we see the need for more discussion. But beyond these core principles of international law, we are also starting to see new areas of interest. And so in the discussions that we have had and in some of the newer national positions, we see increasingly mentioned areas like the peaceful settlement of disputes, the right to self-determination, and international criminal law. And so, Sam, you kindly mentioned the cyber law toolkit. So we also have this aim to help advance the discussion on these issues. And so every year we issue an annual update to the cyber law toolkit, and it contains new scenarios which look at, cutting edge issues. And so just a few weeks ago, we had the annual update for this year, and we have 2 scenarios that map on very well to these emerging topics. So scenario 33 looks at peaceful settlement of cyber disputes, and then scenario 34 goes with this trend of looking more at international criminal law. It covers crimes against humanity committed through cyber means. And so I think we are going to see much more discussion on those topics. For example, on ICL, international criminal law, there's only one national position so far that covers it, and that's Austria. But I think that's going to change in the future. So now finally, the third point, which is, what are the alternative forums that we can look at if, as is starting to emerge in this discussion, if it is true that we cannot expect a lot of movement at the global level. So I think if you look back, there are some reasons for cautious optimism, actually. So, and I think some of the credit actually also belongs to the open-ended working group, because the discussions that were taking place there and also states' sense of, the amount of progress that could be reached have actually catalyzed developments outside of the walls of the United Nations. And so I would just flag 3 points on, these alternative forums that we might want to keep an eye on in the future. So the first one is about the tangible developments we have seen in regional organizations. So the African Union and the European Union both adopted common positions on the application of international law in the cyber context just last year. And so this shows that regional engagement can help generate clarity even whether this global consensus is a bit elusive. And so perhaps there is a potential for other regional organizations, maybe here we can discuss ASEAN, in doing so in the future. Then the second point or second vehicle of progress outside of the UN, and that has actually become one of the most dynamic channels for legal progress, is the adoption of national positions. And so it's interesting to listen to state representatives, what they say about that. And in the introduction to the Finnish position, Ambassador Maria Lehto said, well, a lot of the states were actually catalyzed by the failure of the 2017 GGE to reach a consensus report to start looking at these topics domestically, and that's behind the reason of adoption of some of these national positions. And so I think that's definitely the case. So, you know, the somewhat lack of progress at the global level can then translate into more thinking at the national level and the adoption of more national positions like that. And so, like I said, so far, we have seen the adoption of 35 of such positions that are tracked in the database on the Cyber Law Toolkit. And Thailand, Pauline will speak in a moment, is among the newest with a national position. And then finally, the third vehicle for further progress is academic analysis. And so I would say that we can also expect more academic projects to pool states in the future, like the Tallinn Manual project did about 10 years ago with the first and the second Tallinn Manuals in 2013 and 2017, because the analysis of these academic projects, which are mapping convergences and divergences, can also help guide states develop their own interpretations. And we try to do a little bit of that also in the context of the handbook project. So to sum up, even if the UN process might seem a little bit slow to us, the conversation will continue and mature elsewhere. So overall, I am cautiously optimistic, even though I agree with you that we also have to be realistic. Thank you.
Well, with that optimistic but pessimistic but optimistic finish, we might hand over to Pauline, who is a Minister Councillor at the Department of Treaties and Legal Affairs in Thailand. He was relevant for this, the pen holder of Thailand's national positions, and has attended 4 OEWG sessions, including the final session in July. So he will give us our final session for this webinar, and then we'll open to questions.
Thank you, Samuel. So good afternoon from Bangkok, and it's a great pleasure to join this distinguished panel. And I thank the Center for International Law for inviting me to join this conversation. So today I've been asked to share my thoughts on 4 key areas. So the first is influence on the OEWG process on the trend of national position. Second, Thailand's impact on Thailand internal legal and policy experience. Third, the prospect of a regional ASEAN position. And fourth, the future of global cyber governance. So let me address this point in that order. So on the first point, one of the clear successes of the OEWG process, in international law section, has been the growing number of state and regional groups publishing the national position on how international law applies in cyberspace. And Thailand is very proud to join that group and at the last substantive session. So the OEWG provided both the encouragement and also the normative space for state to engage in the legal articulation, allowing states to move beyond general affirmation to more precise view on how different principles of international law, such as due diligence, sovereignty, non-intervention, state responsibility, etc., applies to cyberspace. The nature and the frequency of the substantive session of the OEWG itself, in turn, created a gentle push for states to consider their position on this issue as they discuss along in the process. And I must say, as the pen holder of the Thai national position, that without this outside influence and the impetus from the OEWG, it would not have been easy for us, the MFA, to drive our national process, to get the buy-ins from various technical agencies, and to eventually find consensus among many agencies. as I mentioned many times in the past, Thailand does not usually put forward a legal position on something unless we really have to. So the OEWG was really important, a driving factor for us. And having said that, I also share, the view that many already spelled out here that, I must say that we had hope for a stronger reflection on the point of convergence in legal views in the final report of the OEWG. And why the OEWG report has succeeded in affirming that international law applies, as Alan said, so it still fell short of capturing more detailed areas of emerging consensus. And I understand that there are polar opposite views on certain elements of legal principle. But, while we listen to the debate in the process, we certainly felt, Thailand certainly felt that there was more middle grounds on some of these issues. And that's why Thailand joined a cross-regional group. We joined since the group was like 7 members, and the number tally up to about 21. This group advocated for more languages to reflect some of the consensus view in the final report. And on issue like state responsibilities, the international humanitarian law, international human rights law, for example. So we really felt there was some degree of language that could be pushed, but ultimately it was deleted at the last version. So despite the success of the OEWG amidst this geopolitical difficulty, we felt it was also a missed opportunity to signal a collective legal clarity to the international community. Still, the process itself as a whole has empowered states, particularly the developing countries like us, to build internal legal position and contribute to shaping cyber norms grounded in international law, which is the area that were perhaps dominated by developed Western states in the past. And this transitioned me to Thailand experience itself. Our national position was a product of a coordinated process involving over 20 agencies. The desire to develop one was triggered both by the OEWG process and by our internal question on how we can deal with cyber attacks on our infrastructure. So at the beginning, we gathered diplomat lawyers to study and form core legal concept applicable to cyberspace. And then we try to explain this legal concept to other agencies. And we absolutely confuse everyone doing so. But because of the OEWG process, we were given many opportunities for capacity building. And that's very important. We sent our lawyers and technicians to different workshops and seminars, including the one with Kubo and the NUS in the past. We partnered with UNIDIA and some think tanks to host regional cyber workshop in Bangkok. We had a national workshop for all agencies coming together, be in the same room, trying to tackle scenario-based exercises, and think through those legal concepts together. So this effort eventually brought everyone on the same page, speaking the same language. And then the drafting was possible and eventually finalized. So in the end, I am also proud to say that our national position does not only reflect the legal doctrine, but also our own operational experience and our cyber posture. And this has already proven its utility beyond diplomacy. So in recent months, I want to share this frankly, we had faced a series of sophisticated cyber intrusions affecting both government website and infrastructure. So in evaluating the possible legal and strategic response options, our National Cyber Security Agency has used the published Thailand national position as an interpretative tool, particularly in applying the due diligence principle and the threshold for attribution under international law. And on top of this, 2 weeks ago, our National Security Council used our national position as part of a nationwide tabletop exercise with the EU. So this shows that the national position is not simply a diplomatic instrument, even though that one key area that we hope it would be, but it's also an internal legal benchmark that guiding real world cyber incident assessment and response. Now transition to the next question, which is, could ASEAN produce a common or allied legal position on cyberspace like the AU and the EU? And to be honest, I was skeptic. I was a skeptic when I was asked this question 2 years ago by Kubo, I think, or Daniel, I can't remember. But however, I start to see a growing interest in this idea, especially after some struggle that the OEWG itself had on international law. So while ASEAN has focused thus far on confidence building measures and the technical cooperation, there's a shared recognition of importance of international law in cyberspace in our ASEAN leader statement. However, challenges remain, of course. Legal system and strategic culture, cyber capabilities still differ widely across ASEAN member states. But that said, Thailand supports the idea of an informal regional dialogue on common legal principles. Even if a formal regional position may not be immediately achievable, we can start by identifying shared foundations such as the UN Charter that Alan mentioned, or principle of state responsibility as the first steps. And perhaps ASEAN could consider an informal ASEAN-level expert exchanges, possibly in a workshop format, to explore convergence on key principles and assess feasibility of a joint statement in a longer term. What is clear though is such effort would strengthen ASEAN collective voices in the global mechanism, something that we lacked during the OEWG process, and basically to demonstrate our region's readiness to engage constructively in legal norm development. And finally, on the transition on future mechanism, so we welcome the establishment of the single track and permanent forum for advancing multilateral cooperation on international cybersecurity. We must credit states, as well as the chair and his team, for navigating a very complex geopolitical landscape to achieve consensus on the global mechanism. And we view the global mechanism as an essential platform for continuing legal dialogue, monitoring state implementation, and building normative capacity across the region. For this mechanism to succeed, though, we believe it has to include 3 elements. So 1, support for capacity building and technical legal integration, particularly for developing states. 2, engagement with non-state stakeholder that Michael mentioned. So those 2 elements were largely much agree across the floor, despite some level of differences on the modalities. However, we feel what is really missing, the 3rd key element, is a dedicated track on the legal norm and international law for expert group. So it's also disappointing that the lack of this dedicated legal track could not be agreed. Well, the track could not be agreed at the OEWG. And the reason for the lack of consensus was really political rather than something more on the substantive side. There were great fear on having this track would allow the conversation to lead to let's say a binding instrument, even though we have had this discussion for 5 years and it hasn't led to a binding instrument. But that's a political reality that we have to tackle. But in any case, so Thailand is ready to contribute to the design and the launch of this mechanism, informed by our national and regional experience. Basically, it's our interest to ensure that cyberspace remain governed by law and not just by power and technology. And just one final point, that I agree with Michael that a better stakeholder modality is needed to allow that kind of joint analysis, and rather than having parallel statements back and forth for another 5 years. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that's a good way to segue into my first question whilst we wait for people to either write questions in the chat or through the other moderators. I wanted to ask on this idea of treaty. It's something that comes up regularly, I think, in this space. Obviously, we have done fantastic work having national positions, an increasing volume of material for states and academics and corporations to call upon when we're trying to figure out what the frameworks are. But for each panelist, if you would like to give your words on, I guess, one, the likelihood of a treaty in the next 10 years, and two, whether or not you think if there is a singular treaty or if there will be multiple treaties as we see regional fragmentation that goes on. We might go in the order of which we have presented so that we can keep it simple. So Hugh, over to you first.
Thank you very much, Sam. Do I see a likelihood of a treaty? My reading of the open-ended working group positions on this is that there are around 8 states who are supporting a proposal for a legally binding treaty of some kind, and many more than that who are either outright opposing it or questioning the rationale for it, the rationale that there are somehow gaps in the application of international law in cyberspace that need to be filled, and yet there are no details coming from those states who are proponents of a treaty to identify what those gaps are and why they exist exactly. So I do not see the prospects as good. What I feel there is much more support for, I mean, I very much, let me be clear, I very much support the idea that there should be a development and a common ground on the application of all of these areas of international law that we've been talking about in cyberspace. I'm in that position. But what I see from states in the working group, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is much broader support for an easier to accept consensus on the non-binding voluntary norms of responsible state behavior. And it seemed to me that that is a missed opportunity in itself as well, that there is not more discussion identified for the global mechanism on those 11 norms, or of the, I forget the name of it, I think it's the checklist of actions that states can take to implement these voluntary norms. This seemed to me to be some common ground that could have been identified for specific work, a dedicated thematic group going forwards. So, Sam, a short answer is I don't see the prospects as very good, and I think we've missed an opportunity on the non-binding norms. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, do you have thoughts on it from your perspective?
Just, Sam, I think you've asked a really tremendous question, and I'm glad you've asked. I'm intrigued to see what everyone else's answer is in addition to Hugh's. The odds are very hard to assess, but I think there are things we can foresee which could increase the odds. And 3 come to mind. So one actually would be successful implementation of the OEWG and global mechanism that essentially builds trust and verification practices. If we see that progress, that could increase the likelihood of state appetite for a treaty. I think another factor which could go a long way in this environment, but which seems hard to foresee, would be sustained de-escalation. Again, hard to see, valuable on its own. Or a third factor that could shift towards a single treaty, and one that, of course, we would hope to avoid at all costs, would be a major cross-border cyber crisis that actually in turn creates political will for framework convention, probably with annexes. You know, different scenarios there which could increase the likelihood of a single treaty, TBD whether any of those actually arise in time. Until then, I think the practical path is probably layered governance. So, you know, UN-led implementation, measurement, regional multipliers, sectoral approaches, all of this ideally being interoperable, but only time will tell.
Thank you. Alan?
Thank you, Samuel. Well, the short answer for me would be that I don't see the likelihood as a very high likelihood. Um, I agree with Hugh that just reading the room, it doesn't seem like that many states currently have the appetite to negotiate the treaty yet. It looks like the priority task at hand should be identifying gaps in the application of existing international law principles first. And I would say that if we have undertaken and completed that process of identifying the gaps, and at the end of that process, if states see that there is a multitude of gaps that require addressing, then that may in turn increase the likelihood of a treaty, and that may in turn increase states' appetite for a treaty. But until that exercise is conducted comprehensively, I don't see the likelihood as being very high. I would say that for myself, I would think that for the future mechanism, the primary focus of the future mechanism, at least when it comes to international law, should be on identification of the gaps and bridging the differences and the divergence that are in the room. We have throughout the course of the OEWG in the past 5 years, we have seen increasing convergence on a number of areas. I think that's a positive development, but at the same time, we still see very wide divergences on certain key areas remaining. So I would say that the primary focus of the future mechanism should be identifying and then seeking to bridge and narrow those gaps. And of course, the hope is that with more discussion, with more robust discussion on a more granular level, in fact, that narrowing and bridging of the divide can become better and better, and the differences will get narrower and narrower. So that's just my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
And very valuable 2 cents as well, I think, from where you're sitting. Kubo, your thoughts?
I think I agree with Alan. A couple of years ago, in 2019, I think, I wrote a piece for the American Journal of International Law Symposium, in which I asked, how likely is it that we would have, and I actually put it in the piece, a 2025 cyberspace treaty. And the answer that I gave those 6 years ago was that it's not very likely. So I'm glad that I got that right. It's 2025, almost the end of it, and I don't think we're going to see it adopted by the end of the year. So it's harder to predict, the forthcoming decade, but I think the assessment stays broadly the same, which is that we are going to see continued advocacy for such a binding legal instrument from certain quarters. I haven't counted the states, but I think what Hugh says is about right. But I would like to make a different point, which is that sometimes when folks speak about this, they put the emergence of national positions and the track leading ultimately to a binding legal instrument as mutually exclusive options. But I think they are not mutually exclusive, and I think that's important to acknowledge. And actually, the seeds for that are already in the OEWG report, which we have mentioned that it encourages more and more states to adopt national positions. I think that's a really welcome development. But, tucked away at the end of paragraph 43 is subparagraph E, which notes the possibility of future elaboration of additional binding obligations. Doesn't mention a binding legal instrument. We know the history behind that, but we see that the seed for that is planted, and so to my mind, the advocacy for that is likely to continue. And also, if you read some of the existing national positions from, not from the global north, but the national position of Brazil, of Cuba, of Pakistan, and indeed of Russia, they are actually national positions which express themselves on how to apply international law in the cyber context, but they also say that it is possible or sometimes desirable to progress with the adoption of a binding legal instrument in the future. So I think my 2 cents to this debate are, it's difficult to say what will happen in the next 10 years, but I think these discussions will continue in parallel. And then I agree that the adoption of national positions and their analysis mapping of divergences and convergences is really useful to help identify whether there is indeed a need, or what could be the topics that are sometimes described as gaps or divergences between state positions, and which could then form the core of a future treaty on these issues.
Pauline, do you have anything further to add?
Yes, just quickly. So I very much agree with Kubo here that, the national positions and the possibility of, binding agreement is not mutually exclusive. And I just want to mention that, Thailand and many other countries that I heard in the room were quite open for those, binding agreement if it can be established what kind of, what elements in the agreement that we will be negotiating, for example, and that in turn take the effort that we have to identify the existing gap in the law first. So I just want to mention that, but also I really agree that it's unlikely, maybe even in 10 years, because trust is a key of any, agreement making, especially at the UN level, and trust is at premium right now. And next year, we're going to have the Crimes Against Humanity negotiation from the ILC text. That's going to take a lot of trust to move anywhere. And even though for the agreement that we have had trust and we have achieved it, like the BBNJ agreement, for example, the High Sea agreement, now we're working on the detail on how to make it work in practice. And, the gaps and the previous position that state took now start to emerge and creep in again, because how to put the agreed text into practice, states do have different, but those are the minor degree. But again, the trust at the very top level for something this big, it's going to take a lot of time. Thank you.
Well, we haven't had any questions then from attendees in the interim, but to wrap up on what you've said, I'm reflected perhaps from a lesson from history, which I know Hugh will roll his eyes at, as he and I disagree on the importance of history, as he's told me in confidence. But I am reminded of the debates that went on after the Great War, and various weapon systems were being contemplated being banned. And the short history was that if you're winning, you don't ever ban the weapon system that you're winning with. And it seems to me that we're in a position that those that are technologically advanced logically would not seek to curtail themselves, whilst the arms race, if we've used the cyber domain as such, as a domain in which an arms race is occurring, that they are growing ahead. I think that there is a risk that there will be a fragmentation of, I guess, states that do wish to control cyberspace and the cyber domain, creating some sort of framework that is obviously voluntary, that they themselves abide by, whilst other states leave it behind, and we start to see a fragmentation. Cyber still remains one of the few, if the only domain, that I think that we are still debating whether or not and how international law applies. But that is a big step from where we were 10 years ago in terms of, does international law apply in this domain? Kubo, you said something in terms of you have cautious optimism in this space and the importance of the development in regional engagements. I thought we might try bring it back to the region that we're in with ASEAN and what a national statement might look like in this space. Now, obviously, there's nothing in writing or in development at the moment, but do you think ASEAN is in a position to be able to give a statement, or do you think we're way off in that respect? So I might hand to Michael to start with, in terms of your working in this space. Do you think there is an appetite for regional approaches from the work that you're doing in Microsoft?
Yes. Actually, Sam, just to point out, there are two questions in the Zoom Q&A.
Not that I can see. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. In case we want to address those.
I think we do.
As well, Sam. And so with that in mind, do you want to just, I don't know.
Yes, we'll go with Sue's question. So she has two, actually. She's done a double. Do attacks on maritime infrastructure, such as ships, ports, offshore infrastructure, differ from general C&I attacks? And then the second question is, does the UN's current cybersecurity agenda sufficiently address the maritime dimension, or is this area best left under the leadership of the IMO, given its sectorial expertise? Do we have any takers for the maritime domain? Otherwise, I'll start to use my moderator prerogatives and start pointing at people on the screen. All right.
I can jump in just very briefly. I am far from an expert on this, and I note that the question asks very generally: do attacks on maritime infrastructure differ from general critical national infrastructure attacks? So I will not cover the technical aspect at all, but just from the legal perspective, because they refer to the maritime environment, the difference is that the law of the sea would apply to such operations. And so in the cyber law toolkit, we have an older but not very old scenario, which is scenario number 16, and that relates to cyber attacks against ships on the high seas. And so it looks at questions like, can operations of this kind violate also generally applicable rules like the prohibition on intervention that we discussed earlier, but also what is their relevance from the perspective of the law of the sea. And so the questions that arise there are questions related to flag state jurisdiction and to maritime law enforcement operations. So I would just refer our questioner to this scenario, which contains quite a detailed analysis, which can help answer some aspects of the question.
Halloween?
Yes, well, just a quick answer. I think it's up to the state, right? Because different state has different priorities and the national interest. So I can suppose that maritime nations who has special interest in maritime matters would place the maritime infrastructure high up in the list of their critical infrastructure, and they will also have their own domestic law to deal with that. So short answer is basically these are the area that's up to the state, right? They can place the importance as they want. Thank you.
So then we have one more question from Jennifer Tritgel. So the new UN bodies on global AI governance are limited to the non-military domain and do not refer to AI for military purposes. What avenues do you think lie ahead in this context for global governance of dual-use technology, such as open source software or open source AI?
I can have a first go if you like.
Yes, please.
So, thank you. So I've been following the developments at the UN on AI governance, in particular the two reports of the high-level body that fed into the Governing AI for Humanity reports that fed into the Summit for the Future and then produced the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact. And the bodies that come out of that, the scientific body, first of all, and then secondly, a global dialogue on AI. I'm not aware that I would agree that they don't place very much emphasis on security aspects, on lethal autonomous weapon systems or AI-enabled cyber operations, as we've been discussing in this meeting. But I don't think they're excluded as far as I'm aware. So the question implies that these aspects are not included. I think they are. And one of the points that I would have made if I'd had more time in my original intervention was that I would really encourage states to raise these issues in the global dialogue. If there is an area that needs governance within the UN, it should not just be cyber, but also AI-enabled cyber. So that's my first attempt at this question.
Michael?
Thank you, Sam. Maybe if I can just help to build on Hugh's reflections there. So absolutely, I think the distinction between AI and cyber will blur more and more as time goes on. Specific to the question, so last October in the first committee session of the General Assembly, the General Assembly, the First Committee adopted its first resolution on AI in the military domain, which then was passed in the broader General Assembly in December. One of the core aspects of that resolution, which was penned by the Netherlands and South Korea quite successfully, was to mandate the Secretary General to write a report on AI in the military domain beyond fully lethal autonomous weapons. So there is already a GGE on laws. This specifically resolution looks at AI in the military domain more broadly. And in the Secretary General's report, which came out in July, if I remember correctly, that included invitation for states to submit their views, states' views, as well as stakeholders, so that their views could be included in an annex. That report came out in July. It sets some very high-level overview of where state consensus currently lies. But what I think this indicates, based on other UN diplomatic processes, is that where the direction of the conversation will go. So right now, October, the First Committee will meet again in its session later this month in New York, and they're expected to vote on a second resolution on this topic. One possible outcome of that was that it will mandate the Secretary General to hold state consultations, just as happened in other diplomatic processes. And with that, in a couple of years' time, a couple of resolutions' time, if there is appetite, we might see some kind of OEWG equivalent on AI in the military domain. Of course, to be determined based on various factors. But what really matters here is that states do engage on this topic. We are at a crucial inflection point now about making decisions on norms, accountability, transparency, due diligence, which will have ramifications for many, many years to come. And actually it really needs to be done correctly. One real challenge here is that UN processes are very slow, as we know, and yet this is a topic that's advancing very, very quickly. There is a great role for states to play, for industry to play, for civil society to play. And so even outside of the UN processes, there are others to pay attention to. One is REAIM, the Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit Series, last held in Seoul in September, and the forthcoming summit, REAIM 3, due to be held in Spain sometime in 2026. Watch this space, but do seek to participate if you are able to.
Well,
If I may,
oh, sorry, yes, please.
if we still have enough time, I would just add two quick points. One is that from a legal perspective, we are not in a vacuum when it comes to the use of AI for military purposes in times of armed conflict. We have international humanitarian law, which is the body of law that applies in situations of armed conflict. And that body of law is technologically neutral. So in other words, it doesn't say that, conduct that amounts to attacks against civilian objects is only prohibited if you use traditional or kinetic means of warfare. It also applies to the times when the militaries are using AI-enabled or AI-powered tools to conduct these operations. Sometimes, there are questions of, in the cyber context, which cyber operation qualifies as an attack. And all of this becomes more complicated when it comes to AI-enabled cyber operations. But we do have a binding body of law that is very rich. The 4 Geneva Conventions, there are 3 additional protocols, and a plethora of other treaties and customary international humanitarian law. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, it's true that a lot of these questions are unsettled or are being debated right now, and I agree with all the list of the processes that we have heard about from you and Michael. We are currently working on a project with NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, so NATO CCDCOE, which will result in the publication of a book. It's an edited volume. We have a list of top experts that are looking exactly at this AI cyber nexus. So I think for a number of people on this call, this might be interesting. The book is not yet out. We will have a symposium, a closed-door symposium with our authors at the end of this month, but we did a preview of some of the chapters first at a conference in Tallinn in Estonia earlier this year, and then later the contributions were published as blog posts on this platform called Articles of War, which is a US-based blog, Articles of War. And so they previewed a couple of chapters that look exactly at these substantive questions of AI cyber nexus when it comes to military uses of artificial intelligence in times of armed conflict. So I think it can also be of interest to our questioner. Thank you.
Well, with 5 minutes left on the clock, I think we might call it there. I don't see any new questions in the chat, and anything would be a can of worms that we'd have to spend hours trying to answer in this very complicated space. And And I'd like to finish on that, being that, you know, Kubo's point about IHL applies in all domains and at all times. It's an important point that the ICJ made in the nuclear weapons case, that the law of armed conflict applies to past, current, and future armed conflicts. It is domain agnostic, but we're not often talking at the level of armed conflict. And I think that's part of the big difficulty here, is that costs are low in cyberspace, both in terms of the physical the financial cost of taking operations, as well as the political cost if caught. Recently, the United States was accused of breaching the prohibition on non-intervention in Greenland, and their response was for Denmark to, quote, calm down. This is, in some respects, the answers that are given when caught in cyberspace: an apology or a calm down. And of course, the articles on state responsibility tell us that only countermeasures can be taken for a lot of these internationally wrongful acts. Cyberspace speeds it up to a point where parts of international law really are under friction. I think that the state positions are fantastic, and we should probably do this next year to compare and contrast any new statements. But thank you very much for joining us, and we will leave the webinar there.